Lady English lecture. I'm Georgina Paul, and I am at present the acting principal of St Hilda's. We're in between two principals, with Professor Sir Gordon Duff having left or retired in July, and our new principal, Professor Sarah Springman, arriving on the 1st of February. So this is why I'm acting in between. Acting like mad. I'm delighted to welcome on behalf of the college our distinguished guest this evening, as well as the many college members, students, alumni and staff who are here. And I'm going to extend as well greetings from Oxford to all those watching the event online via the live stream or the recording afterwards. It is a quite particular privilege and honour to welcome as our speaker this evening Joan Bakewell, Baroness Bakewell of Stockport, whose name has long been on the college's wish list for this annual lecture, so it feels like the realisation of a hope and a dream. We're delighted, Lady Bakewell, that you accepted our invitation and have been able to join us at this celebratory moment when we are able to meet once again in person. We also have with us in the audience Lady English, in whose name this annual lecture series was established in 2013. It's very good to have you and Sir Terence with us this evening. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Joan Bakewell, properly in just a moment, but I want to preface my introduction with just a few words about the Lady English lecture. Judith English was principal of St Hilda's College from 2001 to 2007, and on her retirement as head of house, she set up a fund, the Lady English Fund, to support a series of lectures or seminars related to equality of opportunity, including, but not limited to, gender equality. The level of donations received outstripped expectations, and over the past 14 years, the fund has been used to support a student-run gender equality, or latterly feminist, festival, as well as, for the last 8 years, an annual lecture dedicated to the theme of equality. I should say that in 2020 we missed a year because of the pandemic, so it's nice to be back in the routine. Lady English has asked me to express once more her appreciation to the many members, alumni and friends of St Hilda's who contributed to that fund and whose generosity has enabled us to invite to the college an impressive sequence of distinguished speakers who have addressed the topic of equality in intriguingly varied ways. Joan Bakewell is known to us all first and foremost as a public broadcaster, journalist and writer who has managed to maintain her high profile in the profession for the best part of 60 years, an absolutely remarkable achievement. Her first public television broadcast was for the BBC programme Table Talk in 1962, but her reputation was firmly established as one of 4 presenter interviewers on the BBC nightly show Late Night Line-Up, which ran from 1964 to 1972. It was a programme whose taboo-breaking style and lines of inquiry epitomised the intellectual confidence of the late 1960s. Writers and actors, musicians from the classical, jazz and pop worlds, academics and filmmakers were among those interviewed, and to read the list of interviewees today is to read a roll call of the most prominent artists of the age. There were also programmes that addressed historic issues, notably a famous edition that reported from Prague at the time of the 1968 Prague Spring. But I was delighted too to find on BBC iPlayer in my searching a recording of an interview conducted by Joan Bakewell on the 1st of February 1968 with Lady Asquith and Lady Stocks on the subject of suffragettes, which is, amongst other things, a most interesting study in accents, not least Joan's own. As my mother used to say in her later years when hearing broadcasts from the 1960s, whatever happened to our vowels? Now, Joan was notably the only woman presenter involved in the lineup of Late Night Lineup. The programme's producer, Tony Garnett, was once asked in an interview what it was like working with Joan Bakewell, to which he answered, "She's not bad for a bloke." Joan's comment to that, "That's exactly how I wanted to be seen. They did treat me like a bloke. That was part of it." Now, this must actually have taken some nerve, and it certainly radiated a degree of self-confidence that made its mark on younger women who followed in the trail she had blazed. And certainly I remember this famous voice when I was at school. Later, alongside her continuing work as a journalist, Joan Bakewell hosted the TV programme Heart of the Matter, 1979 to 2000, a late-night show that debated topical religious or ethical issues. Topics covered included subjects as diverse as substance abuse, the effects of anti-personnel landmines, and homosexuality. The heart of the matter became in due course the title of a memoir published in 1996, one of a number of autobiographical works of which other titles include The Centre of the Bed, 2003, The View from Here, Life at 70, 2006, Stop the Clocks, Thoughts on What I Leave Behind, 2016, and the most recent, The Tick of Two Clocks, A Tale of Moving On, which was published this year. As this list of titles indicates, and I haven't mentioned the novels or the plays, Joan Bakewell's writing over the last decade and a half has circled quite prominently around the topic of ageing. In 2008, Harriet Harman, as Equality Minister in the Labour government, appointed Joan Bakewell as the voice for older people, to be what she called, quote, an independent and informed advocate, unquote, on issues affecting older people's lives. Given the disproportionate effect on older people of the pandemic of the last 20 months, this was one topic I proposed to Joan as a possible subject matter for this evening. She has, however, chosen to focus her lecture on another area, and that is social mobility. Joan, born in Stockport into a family that numbered lead miners, iron turners, and coopers in the immediately preceding generations, and educated at Stockport High School for Girls, was, in her own account, made by her scholarship to Newnham College, Cambridge, to study economics and history. While she sits these days as a Labour peer in the House of Lords, she maintains the critical eye for her environment that has distinguished her entire journalistic career and isn't, I think, taking anything for granted, either in terms of her own position or the opportunities that are available or not to those growing up in today's world. Since we at St Hilda's value very highly our mission as an educational institution to open doors for the brightest and most talented, regardless of social standing, and are extremely proud of our record as a college of supporting those from underprivileged backgrounds, it is an honour to invite Joan Bakewell to the platform to jolt us out of our equanimity by speaking on social mobility, high hopes, and low expectations.
Thanks very much, Dr. Paul, for those flattering words. I'm delighted to be here. Lady English, Sir Terence, Dr. Paul, guests. My title, you will agree, could stand for much of today's political rhetoric and social analyses, telling us with statistics and graphs how society matches up to these abstractions, hopes, expectations, and what we should do about them. Tonight, I'm going to abandon abstraction, strip away the rhetoric, and take the title into the realm of real life, my own life. I hope by charting my own background and indeed foreground to point up the nature of social mobility as I have lived it. And in many instances, the story is far from a direct line of progress, if you can call it progress, and in many instances a confluence of chance, history, and persistence. as well as the influence of direct political policy. Now, both my grandfathers, were factory workers, and already in their lives you can perceive influences that impact on social mobility through the early 20th century. Grandfather Bland was a cooper. He made barrels for beer and was employed full-time in a brewery in the Midlands. When his job ended, family records don't tell why, he applied for help to his union. The union did not protect his job, but found him another one in another city. He was required to move his entire family lock, stock, and barrel, and ended up in Gorton in Manchester, still an inner-city working-class area, working at a local brewery there, Ardwick Brewery, where he remained for the rest of his working life. The union had been his support, and the union movement had, since its founding, been a mainstay of working-class security and wage settlements. My other grandfather was an iron turner and worked in a foundry. He is said to have died of an industrial illness, and protection negotiated by his appropriate union either wasn't sound enough or simply failed in his case. But the presence of the union movement had been an important and growing force in both their lives. The trade union movement has from the start been not only a defense for its members, but important in improving social welfare and giving scope for social mobility. Its origins go back to before the 19th century. Early gatherings to protest at poor wages were, of course, illegal. The Tolpuddle martyrs were transported to Australia in 1834 for coming together with other farm workers in Dorset. On their return, they were hailed as working-class heroes. And from that time on, protest and unions grew in power. Unions of dockers, miners, those in transport, factory workers grew steadily in numbers and influence. From the start, they were concerned about the working and living conditions and opportunities of their communities. The Trade Union Congress brought them all together in 1867. In the post-World War II era, professional and white-collar workers formed strong unions. Today, there are unions in every working job: footballers, actors, nurses, bus drivers, journalists. They all reach their peak of numbers and influence. There was a time in the early 1970s when I belonged to 3 different unions: one for journalism, one for television, and one for acting. Several of them had closed shops. You couldn't go on stage and perform unless you were a member of Equity. Then, by the 1970s, union demands escalated further than political structures could bear. Their unmet demands triggered a major surge of strikes, known as the Winter of Discontent, with refuse going uncollected in the streets and mortuaries piled with unburied bodies. By the 1970s, I was working in television, and a successful series at Granada was destroyed by ever-accelerating union demands. The programme was called Reports Action. It pioneered the idea of a television telethon, with audiences contributing help, not money. We distributed used cookers and washing machines. We got people cleaning canals. We sent old spectacles by the sackload to India. We even got children adopted. The programme, which went out live, involved banks of telephones manned in the studios by volunteers. As our popularity grew, we had more and more volunteers. Then the union pounced. They demanded that the volunteers became paid workers. Their intervention broke the budget, and Granada, a benign and liberal company, cancelled the series. Not a good look for the unions when we were doing so much good and were ourselves members of those unions. So, unsurprisingly, Mrs. Thatcher swept to power in 1979 and with wide popular support began weakening union power, legislating to make it more difficult to strike. Then she too went too far, prompting a year-long strike of coal miners, 84-85, that split the country. So over this period, under Thatcher, the proportion of workers in unions fell from the high of 52% of the workforce down to 30%. They had lost their power to help. So there was major disillusionment. In 2021, today, trade union membership stands at around 25% of the workforce, some 6.4 million workers. In the face of sustained austerity, membership has been rising for 3 consecutive years. The TUC is getting stronger. What can it now do to aid social mobility? A majority of the 28 states of the EU, plus Norway, provide for workers' representation at board level. It would be a start if it could happen here. Let me now turn to another factor in social mobility in my lifetime. One grandfather died in his 30s and another in his 90s. Oh, you have good genes, people say to me about my still working in my 80s. Indeed, genes are increasingly being analysed as indicators of future success. A report in the July copy of the PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in America, told how researchers used 5 studies tracking the same people, more than 20,000 of them, over many years in the UK, the USA, and in New Zealand, in an experiment in measuring genetic variations, and they came up with a strange finding that there are indeed genetic markers that can be associated with the likelihood of achieving greater success in life, social mobility. Quite how they measure that success is tucked away in the detail. I suspect it's measured in financial criteria, what your earning capacity would be, but please don't ask me to go down that rabbit hole. My point is that in our times, such researchers are going forward to see if there are such connections, coming up with at least some tentative, my word, evidence that there is. The fact is that neither grandfather had anything approaching worldly success. So we move on a generation to that of my parents. How did social mobility manifest itself in their lives at the start of the 20th century? My father, the son of the grandfather who died young, was brought up in an orphanage. It was called Chetham's Hospital, founded in 17th century Manchester by a wealthy wool merchant who left an endowment for the founding of such a school in his name, Chetham's Hospital, for the care of, quote, poor boys. My father and his 2 brothers were lucky to be among those poor boys. In recent decades, this same school has completely reinvented itself as Chetham's Music School, one of the country's most distinguished music schools for gifted children. Well, in my father's day, the young orphans were given a severe and a sound education, physically Spartan, but intellectually high-minded. The school boasts the first free public library in the country, founded in 1653. It's still open today. It's still free. I believe the presence of books in the early years of a child's life can make a big difference. By engaging them with written ideas, they learn early the nature of concepts and debate. albeit if at the start the concepts really mean wicked step-grandmother versus generous dwarfs. At Chetham's, pupils were imbued with a high regard for learning and scholarship, and although they, as orphans, were brought up to find a place among the artisan classes of Manchester, my father went from school to a job in a foundry, they were nonetheless familiar with the hierarchy of knowledge. It was this, a sense of awe towards the world of knowledge and achievement, that I believe fired my own father's ambition. The state of mind that prevailed among his teachers shaped his view of what might be possible in his own life. Likewise, my mother, born to a father who was a cooper, also picked up the idea that learning would be good. Through the intervention of a local worthy who suggested to her parents that she take an entrance exam, she won a City of Manchester scholarship for a place in a local girls' grammar school. This was highly valued, but it was entirely out of her class. Everyone was thrilled at the start at the opportunities it gave her, but sadly those opportunities soon fell by the wayside, victims of the realities of class and money. After a year, age 13, my mother left that school. The family could not afford the uniform, and she had been mocked and ridiculed. Besides that, my grandmother, who went on to have a further 7 children, needed the eldest daughter to go out to work to earn money for the family. So, important teachers, school aspirations, and a glimpse of what was possible fired up both my parents to do better than theirs had done. My mother had taken some sort of job in an engineering firm. This was the second year of the First World War, and she was one of that wave of women given a chance by the absence of men who went away to fight. She was encouraged to go to night school. She did. She studied experimental maths, practical drawing, mechanics, and physics. No softy, she. She became a tracer. At the time when there was no photocopying of designs, they all had to be copied by hand. And she worked in the drawing office in one of the skilled jobs in which women were beginning to work alongside men. She was much in demand. She was good at it. The best tracer of them all, according to my father, who was an engineer working in the same company. But when the head of the drawing office, the job of head of the drawing office fell vacant, she simply wasn't eligible. Men only. Later in life, my mother descended into melancholy and deep depression. It was a terrible strain on the family. I believe that her bright, intelligent character felt repeatedly crushed by the world she grew up in. And I can't believe that that doesn't happen today. Both my parents had found their way to night schools. This is a long time before they met each other. Always a major resource for working class people who want to better themselves. I grew up in a northern town, Stockport, on the border between Cheshire and Lancashire, where there was what was then called a mechanics institute, which enrolled working people, mostly men, to offer them further training in the work they did. There is an irony here because I'm currently president of Birkbeck University College in the University of London. Birkbeck was founded in 1823 to offer education to the working classes. Dr. George Birkbeck and other philanthropically minded figures put out a notice saying that if working people were interested in getting an education, they should gather at the Crown and Anchor Tavern in the Strand on the evening of November the 11th, 1823. 2,000 people turned up. There was clearly a need. Within a month, the first Mechanics Institute opened. Very soon, a network of such institutes, Mechanics Institutes they were called, were set up around the country. And, to their credit, just 7 years later, in 1830, they admitted women. We at today's Birkbeck offer full degree qualifications to working people who study with us, while also earning a living in a full-time job. The degrees are widely acknowledged by employers as the equivalent of any university degree across the country, and are a major stepping stone in the social mobility of today's working people. As I hand out the degrees on graduation day, I think back to my father and indeed my mother's own disappointed aspirations. Sometimes women who are graduating bring along a toddler onto the platform, explaining, "I was studying when I was pregnant, so they deserve to be here too." Women still have a tough time if they want to get on and improve their pay and their standards of living. Childcare is recognized as a major problem. Too expensive for the lowly paid, sometimes unreliable or too far away. Your social mobility is seriously blocked if you decide to give time and attention to your babies. So I had enthusiasm for social mobility knit into my background. In my own life, I can reckon to have had possibly good genes, good teachers, books on the shelves, aspiring schools, and further education built into my early years. Today, one of the most powerful drives in the success of young people is said to be their family's outlook towards getting on. Mine was strong, but far from typical. But as I grew up and looked around, I was aware that there was another route to worldly success. For some 10% of the school population, their parents spend money to buy an education that is predicated on giving pupils a better chance in life. They buy social mobility. Britain has around 300 public schools, educating some 6.7 of school children, but these money-privileged children make up 31.5% of university intake and go on to occupy the commanding heights of our society. In 2014, a Social Mobility and Child Poverty Action Commission found 71% of senior judges, 62% of senior armed forces, 55% of Whitehall permanent secretaries, 50% of the House of Lords all went to public school, as had 2/3 of the present cabinet, and as of 2019, 20 prime ministers had been to Eton. All of them feed directly into the old boys' network. If they command the heights of society and the economy, how much harder is it for those who don't enjoy such privilege? The question I ask is this: why didn't the Labour government of 1945, elected by a huge majority and popularity to nationalise many industries, railways, steel, airlines, also nationalise the public schools? Not to abolish them, but to make their excellence and influence open to all. The answer is easy. Labour leaders were primarily from public schools themselves. Attlee went to Haileybury, Dalton was an Etonian, Cripps and Gateskill were Wickhamists, all public school men themselves, not women, of course. And though Bevan and Bevin and Morrison were proudly working class, they did not have the power to lead the change. So we move on to the landmark in my own education. It was the Education Act of 1944, which made grammar schools free for children who passed the 11+. I was 11 at the time. I passed and benefited. My sister, every bit as bright, failed, and her life took a different route. But it did less tangible and just as enduring damage. It became a yawning gap in our family dynamic. My mother's constantly complained to my sister, "If Joan can do it, why can't you?" On a wider scale, this schism, riven through society by the 11 past, contributed to making those who failed the exam feel they had failed in life. My sister, incidentally, found her own route to a successful life as a nurse, a matron, a specialist in childcare. But the damage to her sense of self-worth was considerably and totally undeserved. The 11 plus was a brave attempt at social mobility, but a blunt instrument. It made a whole cohort of young people feel they were failures. It calls into question the emphasis we place on exam results, given huge emphasis from 1944 onwards, and today hanging like a sword of Damocles over the lives of not only stalwart SWATs, as I was, but over the less motivated, less focused, but nonetheless valuable individuals still to find their own direction in life. Today's education ladder, via exams, the pressure to get better and better results, resort to tutors, the need for fluency in job interviews, the possibility of parental connections, still makes it hard for those like my grandfathers and my poor mother, bright but poor, to get to the top, whatever the top might be. And so I found myself with a scholarship to Cambridge, paying nothing for my 3 years there, and leaving to find a world where there was plenty of jobs, cheap accommodation, even in central London. I took a job as a trainee studio manager at the BBC. The barrier I hit at this point was that of my gender. In the 1950s, the world was run by men who held the top jobs and made the appointments. Oh yes, there were women among them at the BBC, very talented women producers and writers, but women were primarily in secretarial roles, struggling to match men in the hierarchy of training and promotion. Well, I have spent 50 years seeing that change, and I am still waiting to see it change enough. Amazingly, women are still not paid the equivalent of men in many television roles. They battle on. This is a community that I know well, that of women, and that's why I speak of it. But of course, I acknowledge there are other communities, the black and ethnic minorities, the disabled, immigrants, who face far more entrenched institutional disadvantages. Social mobility is so often for them a fantasy, an unobtainable charade of class and money. Which brings me to the House of Lords. First, my own story. As you heard earlier, in 2008, I responded to an invitation from Harriet Harman to be the spokesperson for the Voice of Older People, raising the media profile of older generations to explain their inclusion into the Equality Bill, which was then going through Parliament. As a result of that contribution, I was approached by Ed Miliband, who asked me, the Labour Party, he said, would like to nominate me as a Labour peer. They never defined in detail, but what that means. They wanted me to be a working peer. It means you expected to turn up, to support Labour policies and vote in their favour. Each party nominates a tranche of individuals whose names go forward to a committee for the consideration and then approved by the Queen. So that's how you get there. I was taken aback to be approached, primarily, as I explained to Ed, because I hadn't voted Labour in the last election. He was very surprised. I had marched with many hundreds of thousands against the Iraq War, and Tony Blair had gone ahead despite nationwide opposition, so I had voted Green. I felt both Ed and I needed to pause and think, and in the end, my thoughts turned to my factory grandfathers, and most particularly to my disappointed and depressed mother. And I decided to say yes, I would become a Labour peer. I took the oath of loyalty to the Queen and country before an assembled house wearing ermine-trimmed robes. From then on, what happens? I receive regular party briefings on bills going through the House, details of votes expected, party meetings. There's no insistence on attendance and no sanctions if you fail to vote when asked or if you just don't turn up. Many of us, including myself, continue with their working careers and juggle commitments between the two. My contribution I would describe as steady but moderate. I've voted in successive Labour amendments to government bills. I've occasionally asked questions. I belong to select committees. Members of the House of Lords can do as much or as little as they choose. Many are daily attenders, speaking often and familiar with all the quirks of procedure. Others only come in when the call goes out that there's an essential vote. Andrew Lloyd Webber is said to have flown over from New York to help avoid a Tory defeat. Many Lords simply accept the honour and don't attend at all. When the House does vote a Tory defeat, and it does it often, by the way, we did it last night over the sewage issue, huge vote against the government, doesn't make any serious difference. And it's largely overridden by a government majority in the House of Commons, which is, of course, the elected chamber, quite rightly. They are our lawmakers. So what's the point? I'll come to that in a moment. But first of all, who are we? There are currently 791 sitting members, average age 68. It is the second largest legislative chamber in the world behind the Chinese National People's Congress. It's grotesquely large. If you think it needs reform, so do we, all of us. But our own attempts at reform have been maddeningly frustrated. I'll come to that later. We are comprised of 26 archbishops and bishops of the Church of England. Each parliamentary session begins with prayers, Anglican prayers. There is no equivalent quota for any other religion, though there are, of course, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, humanists, sitting individually as members. There are still 92 hereditary peers, there by right of inheritance from families favoured down the centuries by royal honours. The vast majority of such peerages can be inherited only by men. Women were not made peers until 1958 as a result of the Life Peerages Act. There are now 220 women peers, that's 28% of the House. The Labour Party, after its election victory in 1997, introduced legislation to expel all the hereditary peers, but in protracted wrangling about the move, Tony Blair agreed to allow 92 to remain, pending further reform. That reform has still to arrive. However, we are a predominantly appointed, not elected, House, none of us elected. There have been several attempts at reform since 1995, with attempts to make it an elected or at least part-elected House, always being defeated. There has been a more serious and positive attempt at reform made by the House itself, a plan to reduce numbers, inviting resignations for older members, setting a time limit of 15 years membership, a cap of 600 on membership and such. And some of these have already gone into effect. But they were suddenly and brutally overturned by Boris Johnson, who since becoming Prime Minister has created 79 new peers, almost all Tories, and including many cronies, donors and supporters. This remains the Prime Minister's right. What chance do we have of reform? Future changes depend on legislation going through both Houses of Parliament. The prospects are not good. This is clearly deplorable in a country that can claim to have pioneered the concept of democracy. It was under Cromwell that his people, the new model army, formulated the idea of mass engagement with the government of the country. They held a major consultation, the Putney Debates, in 1647, where Thomas Rainbow famously declared, I think the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. Not in the UK, he doesn't. However, as the Lord's is there for the foreseeable future, what does it actually do? We are there to scrutinize, inverted commas here, amend and improve legislation that comes to us from the Commons. There are plenty of Lords well qualified to know more than many MPs about specific topics. Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, sits in the Lords. So do several High Court judges, former trade union leaders, surgeons, chancellors of universities, former secretaries to the cabinet. So it's possible to think of us as a chamber of elders of the tribe. For many, our careers are largely behind us, and we have built up expertise in our sphere of activity. We have time to consider matters others might evade, and because we aren't vying for office, there's less self-seeking than you find among MPs. There is indeed much wisdom. The question I ask is, how is it deployed to the best advantage? I might just say, I hadn't included this until last night when I stayed late to vote with censoring the government on the whole business of sewage in our waterways. And the House of Lords stayed and debated and voted with both sides against this government refusal to accept the amendment that had gone through the previous day. So that was the Lords being useful. It does happen. So here I am, a Labour peer, ostensibly at the top of some sort of tree of social mobility, but I now want to question the whole premise on which I have unfolded this tale. Is social mobility a cutthroat rise by virtue of talent, luck, exams, money, opportunity, really what is best for society? Do those who get on deserve the rewards that come their way? And do those who don't deserve to be considered failures, poorly paid, living lives of struggle and sometimes actual deprivation? Is it the ideal form of social organization, or is it divisive, living generations rejected and resentful, angry, even alienated? In 1958, Michael Young, all-round good guy, socialist thinker, wrote a satire called The Rise of the Meritocracy. It was meant to mock the times in which he lived, the rise of some at the cost of others. But his message was mistakenly interpreted, especially by Tony Blair, as a tribute to the meritocracy, in which the deserving won out through their own merits and left the rest to fend for themselves as undeserving of the top rewards, to live lives less fulfilling than they might have lived had chance fallen some other way, and incidentally, to die at an earlier age. This is now a global problem. The gap between rich and poor, the successful and the so-called failures, those with prosperous lives and those with nothing, is widening across the globe. The rich wallow in gross bonuses, yachts, multiple houses, and stash their wealth in tax havens. Many of the world's poor flee abuse and persecution, risk their lives in the hoping of making them a little bit better. This is not a world we would ever hope to be living in. It is time for the next generation to change that. How? Clearly, structural changes have to happen, and that depends on the politics of the day on a global scale, involving climate change, movements of population, distribution of resources. It can happen gradually with a consensus among the populations concerned, or something else will happen. I'm too old to speculate what that might be. That change is for the next generation, the generation of university students, young people, to make those choices. It's for you to decide. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope we shall have some questions. I'd like to engage with you in what your own ideas of your own place in the world is. So, can we do?
Say thank you very much, Jane, for an absolutely wonderful and stimulating talk. Very widely beyond social mobility. I mean, there's a lot of provocation there in a lot of different areas. My brain is spinning with the provocations. And yes, I think we're going to have at least 20 minutes, I think, for questions. So I don't know if anyone wants to. I can't see the gallery at all, if there's anyone up there, because of the light. I can actually if I dip, but who wants to start?
It's always a pause.
Shall I start? I'm a little reminded. I worked at the University of Warwick for some years, and in that period, I'm the German tutor here as well as acting principal. I used to be in charge of the German exchange students, and I had a video that I showed them to try to introduce them to the British school system, which was called From Butler to Baker. So it had the 1944 Butler Act to the 87, 88 Education Reform Act. So these German, I remember one particular year where the German students looked at this happening, and then the next week I showed them a video about an exchange between an inner city comprehensive school in Liverpool and Rugby. And then the weekend after that I brought them down to Oxford. And there was one year I had a wonderful, wonderful student, very tall girl who'd been to a Rudolf Steiner school and was very, very free thinking. And she'd gone through this sequence of things with me, and she said, the thing you've got to do in this country is get rid of the independent school system. And then on the day in Oxford, she said, and you've got to get rid of this too.
It's not a question of getting rid, is it? It's a question of opening up. I mean, we want more of what is excellent. There's no one can deny that. But it must be available rather than purchased with money.
But because you raised in the middle of the talk, more seriously, about the question of the division that's created by the fee-paying school system, which is there for those who can afford it, and what happens if you have a system like that gets rid of puts the rest somewhere else. And that is actually profoundly divisive. I mean, because I go to Germany a lot, you don't have that in Germany. You don't have that sort of division. And you have a much more egalitarian university system as a result.
It's very interesting because, of course, I can perfectly well see that the schools and the parents would say, if we have worked hard and we have earned our money, we are entitled and have the freedom to buy the things that we want, which will include a good education for our children. There's no, you can't gainsay that the right of people to do that. And if you, as it were, if Attlee had nationalised the schools and they weren't good enough, the parents would have gone to Switzerland or they'd have gone somewhere else. There is no way that you cannot stop. And why would you want to? The freedom of parents and people to set up institutions that teach things. I mean, that has to be a good thing. But what I would argue is that the public school enjoy particularly charitable status favours, which give them continuing advantage, which isn't to the benefit of society generally. It's very nice for them, but it's an advantage that, in a sense, ought to be spread more broadly in the society rather than given them specifically. So I'm only speculating about why the Labour government didn't nationalise them. But there's no doubt the disparity between being able to buy your social mobility and having to earn it is something that's problematic for people. Now, that relates to what I was saying about whether the idea of social mobility in itself is entirely without flaw, because what about the people who can't make it? There's no way that people who can't pass exams, get on in life, have opportunities, should be rewarded in excess compared to the people who just perhaps aren't bright enough in the ways that exams require. Why should they be at a bottom, made to feel they're at the bottom of the heap, when there are virtues in doing carpentry well? There's very good satisfaction in being a good electrician, it must be interesting to work in some sort of community that serves other people. Right at the lowest area of pay and conditions of work are social workers who look after the old. I know this in detail. Their pay is appalling. They aren't paid for the time when they travel from home to home. So, you know, that it's quite clear that needs redress, and that needs teasing out as to how it's going to come about.
How are the young going to do it? Do we have any students who have opinions about what you'd want to do? Well, we've got somebody putting their hand up there.
I'm 68. My husband came from a very poor family indeed, and he got his break by passing the 11 plus and going to grammar school. And he's had a very successful career, but he did have to take a year out and go and work at British Steel to be able to make ends meet, and then went back to his medical degree. But why did the Labour government get rid of grammar schools? Why did the Labour government decide that everybody needed to come to the lowest common denominator and go to secondary modern schools? It's not been a success.
Well, what they did, of course, they didn't abolish grammar schools. They abolished the independence of individual schools called grammar schools. What they did was, my children were part of this, they integrated the grammar school stream into what were comprehensive schools, so that the bright children belonged in the brighter stream. And that's how it was meant to avoid this enormous schism between the privileged grammar school, social privilege, and those who were made to feel a failure. Sometimes it worked very well. I mean, my grandchildren have all been to comprehensive schools, rural comprehensive schools, which work perfectly because all the children in the area go to the same school. And some of them have done well academically and gone off to universities, and others have become a carpenter. They all went to the same school, but they took the path that suited their particular talents while having a sort of social equality with the community around them. And that seems to me what the Labour Party were aiming for. But of course, the grammar schools that survived attracted people who wanted to have, as it were, the advantage. And there has been great confusion. As you know, there are grammar schools that have survived and comprehensive that weren't good enough. So problematic it was, but its intention was to try to eliminate this sense of social superiority that goes with earning more money and getting on in life, which doesn't seem to apply in other societies. I don't think it applies in Denmark. I don't think it applies in Sweden. You have a sort of sense of everyone being citizens, which I don't feel as I move around this country. But that might just be an older generation in the sense that I feel I was rewarded, wasn't I lucky, which I do, incidentally. But it's not how I want my grandchildren's generation to live. And so at the moment, they're much fairer about their society and their status than we were.
Professor Willis. Okay, I think you do for the recording.
Yes, you will, because I'm deaf.
So thank you. I mean, I don't disagree with a lot of what you're saying. I think it was really, really interesting, and I think you're spot on. But having been a tutor in Oxford for 30 years now, I just have one observation to make, and that is that no child chooses where their parents send them to school. So when you're trying to admit students, should you therefore immediately start to discriminate against those that have been to public schools because of the privilege they've had, when actually they had no say in that?
Well, this is a huge dilemma, isn't it? I mean, a huge dilemma. It's not at all surprising that parents who buy financial educational advantage produce clever children, because that's what they are. That's what they're paying for. And along come these bright, fluent, entitled children, and they dazzle and impress the tutors who are going to recruit them. I don't quite know. I know that there are, I understand there are numbers allowed and conditions made. And it was interesting, one of my grandsons who had been to comprehensive got an interview at Oxford, And everybody was, oh, that would be wonderful. So off he went from the comprehensive in the country to Oxford. And he stayed 3 nights, and there was much talk and, you know, general socialising, weighing him up and everything. And he came back, and he didn't get in. And I said, what happened, do you reckon? What was it? And he said, I just didn't know enough. And I think that's interesting because the background of a public school, on the whole, gives you a sort of broader grounding in things like going to museums, having foreign holidays, foreign languages, and so on. And he wasn't at all, he was disappointed, but I mean, it didn't put him off his stride. He just said, I didn't know enough. And that's what you can buy with money, the knowing of stuff. And you come to universities to have the chance to know stuff. So I don't know what the problem is, but I do think it's something we should be aware of. The first thing is to be aware of it and to know that there are bright children living on benefits of families who are disadvantaged. They're living in poor houses. They have the capacity that my grandmother and grandfather and parents had, and they are not getting the chances. And they will be discontent. They will be trouble. They will be fodder for unattractive political, possibly even religious outlook. So they will be available to disturb societies in ways that they don't deserve to and which we don't deserve them to do. So there's a risk attendant on not paying attention to the issue.
I should say, as an admissions tutor myself, as Kathy has been in the past, you shouldn't really just be looking for what people know, should you? You should be looking at that our interview process is about what people do with what you give them. So you always give them something that's
I'm reporting
a little bit too difficult to do, and then you watch the brain work and see. Yeah. And you should be able to just equalise at that point. Yeah.
Yes, I'm reporting what a disappointed
yes, of course, of course. But I wonder that can also be the environment of, you know, hanging around in Oxford or wherever it is for 3 days while you're being interviewed, and all these other people showing off with what they know and read.
He did make a girlfriend.
Good, that's good.
That's what university's for, isn't it?
Maggie Snowling.
Thank you very much for your talk, which I absolutely agree with everything you said. My question is really about government policy on education. I think we're all proponents of excellent education. 2 points, really. First of all, I mean, what is your view about having ministers of education who have no experience of education other than their own? And related to that, if you make comparisons with health, what do you think about rolling out educational curricula and programs which don't have any kind of evidence base?
Could you just make that second point slightly clearer for me? What do I think about?
So I think that what I'm saying is, if you think about health, you have NICE, and they will say, sure, yes, you know, thumbs up, this is a good health intervention, and so we'll back it. There's really very little comparable place in education. There's no NICE of education. We do now have an Education Endowment Foundation that is trying to develop an evidence base, but at the moment when we're shaping education, which we really should be doing for these kids, we're guided by often the Minister of Education's own experience at one of the schools that you've just mentioned.
Well, there are 20 members of the Cabinet who went to Eton, so it's not good leadership, is it? I do think, I mean, it's impossible to know how the Cabinet is appointed and who is made Minister of Education. And there's no doubt that the character and nature of that leadership is crucial, really crucial. And if it's good, the word gets around instantly through civil servants, through conferences, that this person has got a grip and wants to do the job that he or she is given, rather than jockey for the next promotion. So then we call into question the whole cabinet, the way the cabinets are appointed and briefed, and we then have a huge reliance on civil servants. And it's interesting that the grandson who went to a comprehensive and didn't get into Oxford is now in the Department of Education as a civil servant. So there you are. So there is chance here, and there is opportunity. And one of the words I haven't used, I did use the word persistence. There is something that you might call character. I mean, I come from a family that gritted their teeth and said, they're not going to do me down. They're not going to spoil my chances. And there are too many people who feel, well, the world is against me. I don't have much chance. But they need to get together, which is why, in fact, I spoke of the trade union movement. The trade union movement is full of people talking together about what can be done. And I think that's important. I think it needs reviving. It seems an old-fashioned institution, but rather like the Church of England, it's here to stay, and it needs to get its act together. And it is doing right now. But I do think many people probably feel that, well, what can the union do for me? So there must be ways in which people can talk to each other about what they feel the disadvantages are and make that known. And indeed, civil servants. I mean, the civil service union is a very important body, and the policies of education departments, or indeed any department, depend on the civil service being strong and respected, which of course it is not by the current government.
The gentleman at the back, second row from the back.
Thank you. I'm Ed. I'm a third-year student, undergrad
Excellent.
at St Hilda's. So, yeah.
Good for you.
Good. Just a question, really. You've spoken a lot about education so far. I was at a grammar school in Lincolnshire, so passed the 11 plus and got in. I only just passed it actually, but managed to. I think from a school perspective, that it's a lot easier to build aspiration in an independent school or in a grammar school than it is a comprehensive. It's more than possible to do it in any school, but I think the differentiator is aspiration. But if I can move the discussion on slightly just away from education, looking forward in my life, I think the thing that's gonna be difficult is owning things, specifically owning a house. And you were talking a lot about social mobility and the need to own things and sort of feel like you're getting on in life. And the barrier that's currently there to owning a house for young people, I think, is going to be an immense challenge, and it's going to for social mobility. I wondered if you had any views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I still retain a rather teenage sort of blank idealism in which I think that society should be so organised that however young people grow up, in whatever system that we can organise, they should be enabled, all of them, each of them, to enjoy a satisfactory career. I don't mean up some ladder, I mean satisfactory work which they do. They should have a home, and they should have their health. And that is, we're far from seeing that as an opportunity that will arise out of whichever education system you have. And I don't know the answer. I think your points are very well taken, that in fact the situation does not yield the world that we want. And we have to think about that. I'm sorry I can't answer it more than that.
Jan Royal, there we go.
Hello. Yes, Joan is a colleague of mine. She's my role model. It's me, Joan, it's Jan. But it's just to back up what she said about the House of Lords. I'm not defending the House of Lords in its present state, but the fact that there are experts in the House of Lords, in answer to Maggie, that helps make better legislation, because there are educationalists there who know far, far more than our ministers of education. And there was one prime example I came across when we had a Labour government. We had a minister called Aradazi, who is in the Lords. He's just the most wonderful, wonderful medical man. And he would sit around the table with civil servants. And civil servants, God love them, I do love them, would come out with proposals. And he was able to say, well, actually, sounds great, but me as a practicing surgeon, that ain't going to work. That's not going to work. And I think we do need experts. Those people are so denigrated, have been so denigrated in recent debates. And I think that, House of Lords is one place where we do need experts, and we do need experts in the civil service. And all the bright young people coming out of Oxford into the civil service, that's fab. So, keep going, and thank you, Joan.
Yes, that's what I referred to as the elders of there's somebody just behind you, actually, the elders of the tribe. I mean, that you want to cull the sort of wisdom that lifelong careers have deposited within people's personalities. And you do get that in the House of Lords. And they do, I mean, the secretaries to the cabinet know how cabinet government works, and they tell us, and they make it clear, and they make it known, and the records are in Hansard to offer ammunition for people who want change. Probably not enough people want change, Jan, that's what I would say. Yes, can I?
Social mobility, if it's predicated on an unequal education system, surely the answer is to raise the educational standards and achievements of the state educational system. How do you achieve that when the education process, the education system is so divided and bought, as you say, by money?
Well, money, will, first of all, political will. You have to command the support of your electorate, and then you can exercise political will to do something. It is possible. It needs leadership. And leadership sounds unfair, giving some one person more control than the others. But I would cite the success that the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, is enjoying at the moment. Now, he is leading a council, the Labour Council, to make change. And he hasn't been put down by people saying, well, we haven't got the staff or the money or the wherewithal. Let's change it, he says. And he is being very resolute. He's showing leadership. There's also Wes Street in the Midlands. I'm not just speaking of a Labour peer. I'm speaking of Conservative, Labour member rather. I'm speaking also of a Conservative mayor. That these people are getting on with it. They have the political will. They have the leadership skills, and they have managed to marshal the support of the people of their community. This is, for some reason, this seems to be very difficult. Perhaps not so difficult now, because we're kind of led by, well, don't take me there.
Bloop. Nicholas. Wait for the microphone for the recording.
I hate to bring politics into the matter, but how does your very authentic social thinking on social mobility map against what is talked about as levelling up?
Well, levelling up is a way to signal that you are going to please the people who you want to vote for you. It sounds enormously promising, and it's a good phrase. It's better than levelling people down. Levelling up sounds full of promise, but we haven't seen what it amounts to yet. I mean, it's a good catchy phrase, but now we need leadership to tell us what it means. I mean, does it mean everyone having a decent house, decent home, can afford heating? I would call that levelling up. So it's a fantasy, really. It's a very good phrase, and phrases win elections, but they do have to be queried. So I would query that. But I would also say I would query any party's sloganeering, because you need to know how, when, who, etc. So I'm very suspicious, Nick.
Yes, I think, is that John? John Bowers at the back. Yes. Wait for the microphone.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I actually, like the gentleman here, went to a grammar school, which actually then became a comprehensive in Lincolnshire, but in Grimsby. And the problem in Grimsby then and the problem in Grimsby now, I think, is actually the poverty of aspiration. There's some really very bright children, but they just don't think of leaving Grimsby, even to go to Hull, let alone to go to Scunthorpe. So how do you, not that you'd want to go to Scunthorpe, but how do you deal with that? Because that really is a societal problem, even before you get to education. And the other thing I was going to ask, if I may, is you seem to be suggesting that Labour should have opened the public schools up to a wider cohort. I mean, how would that actually have worked? I mean, wouldn't it have been easier just to abolish them?
I think, to take the second point first, I think the tide of for change in 1945 was so exceptionally strong that you could have ridden on the crest of that, and that would have opened up schools, just as it opened up medicine. You know, before the national health, people died because they couldn't afford a doctor. Suddenly it changed and everybody got free medicine. How did that happen? It's political will and leadership and an absolute certainty that you can take people with you when you promise them that. I do know about Scunthorpe, I have to say. What I'm setting out is the problems that we need to solve. So I'm very happy for you to say, all of you to say, yes, but how would you? It's not me. I'm old, I'm over the hill, I don't have the chance to change things. But the young do, and I think we have to depend on them. They're bright, they're clever, they're qualified, and they have to talk to each other and bring about change. And they are doing. Lots of young people are trying to change the climate issue. They're anxious about the cancellation of the foreign budgets. The young have protested about that. My marching days are over. I've marched all my life at various things. I started with the Suez crisis. I went on to nuclear disarmament. I voted against Brexit, and I marched against Brexit, and I marched with the feminists against Trump. So, and that's it. I've done it now. So I can't get out in the streets anymore. It's for the young. I'm here to exhort the young and say what a marvellous opportunity there is, because there is so much to be done.
Well, I'm seeing the possibility for, you're only 4 apart from each other, the 2 Lincolnshire men in the back row, so I hope John is going to help our third-year student with some ideas about how he's going to get a house. And I don't know if anybody else from that area, I can see some familiar faces from our JCR in the back row and round there. I don't know if anyone of you wants to say what your causes are and how you see all of this. Yes, go on. That's it. Good.
I agree that education needs reform, like you, but I just wondered how you kind of felt grammar schools worked in reality now, because I was just thinking about that. I went to a grammar school, and actually coming up to Oxford, I think you get a real sense of divide of people that went to private schools, and then you get people that went to comprehensive schools, and both people can be proud of that or bring that into the discussion. But as a grammar school student, I found that I was kind of a bit discounted because I just went to a free independent school, essentially, is what people say. So I just wondered how you think that education reform should work now, because I don't think grammar schools are the answer anymore.
Tell me, against the background that you've just outlined, have you felt that you're able now to realise yourself and do what you want? Are you listening to your own inner voice, or do you feel you're ricocheting between different systems?
Yeah, I think coming to Oxford, especially a college like this, has really helped, but I do feel that, there are 2 very different systems, as you're saying, and it's kind of hard to place yourself on that spectrum.
Yeah. A lot to think about.
And 2 further on, another view.
I've just also got...
Can you speak up?
Hello. Okay. I also thought it's really interesting what you were saying about grammar schools, and I agree also that there are certain issues with putting so much pressure on 11-year-olds to decide their future. But I also see a big disparity in even comprehensive schools, because quite geographically, if you live in one certain town, there are with the town that I'm from, there are 3 outstanding state schools, but then the town next door, you're really lucky if you end up at the one good one. And I think that's also to do with house pricing and things like that. And I just think that even in state schooling, there's still you can still buy social mobility. So I just kind of wonder if by improving state schools, how do we prevent people from still buying social mobility?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, nobody is the enemy of the good. Nobody is the enemy of what is good. But the things that are good might be lurking in social arenas that do not reach out to everyone else. And it's the structure rather than nature of learning, I think, matters, that needs addressing. Because good stuff, good learning everywhere is precious. And it's to be nursed and extended where possible. And that's a structural thing, and that calls for leadership, and of course it will call for money. We know that. They'll all say money, we haven't got it. Don't believe it.
I'm going to take one last question. The gentleman on the end of the row with a striped T-shirt. Good.
Hi, I'm a first-year graduate student in social policy and intervention here at St. Hilda's. You've talked a lot tonight about
No, you have to, because of your mark.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'm a first-year graduate student in social policy and intervention from the U.S., obviously. And my question is not really about education or policy or politics, but you've spent a lot of time talking about how the change is coming from the next generation, and it's sort of our obligation and our charge to do so. I'm curious what advice or experiences you have about encouraging people, young people, who tend to be more cynical about the change that they're sort of charged with, and what ideas you have about that.
I'm interested in what you say, because it seems to me that we think that you go to school, you learn things, you pass exams, you pass the better exams, you go to university, etc., and then it stops. You have something called a career. I think, and I speak from Birkbeck's experience here, we should go on learning all our lives. And this will come about, one, because skills are changing all the time, and you will know that from your research, that skills are changing and developing. The arrival of AI is going to change everyone's pattern of learning. They're teaching coding to junior primary schools now. They're teaching coding. So the whole way of what we learn is going to change, and we are also, all of us, going to be retraining all our lives and learning to keep up with the expanding amount of knowledge that we're needing to keep up with the pace of change in the world. So I think education is not going to become slotted in those early years, peaking at university and then sort of being signed off. What is interesting at Birkbeck is at 6 o'clock in the evening, people pour into the building, and they've already done a day's work as journalists, accountants, hairdressers, whatever, and they're coming in to further their knowledge at all ages. The oldest have been in their 90s, and then you have mums who are pregnant who are coming along as well. So the generations kind of dissipate as a distinction within the Birkbeck community. And that suits everyone. It suits the academics who are happy to teach at any level and can do it. And it rewards everybody because they're all holding down jobs and renewing their skills. So lifelong learning is on the horizon for everyone, I believe.
Well,
That's not a direct answer to your question, but I'm trying to contribute to your point.
I think lifelong learning is a good note on which to end. I'm also hearing something that you said earlier about listening to your inner voice, which I think is extremely important, isn't it? To sort of, listen to your inner voice and listen to the confidence that you have within you to do what you want to do and what you've got to do. And if you're responding to that, that's the key to success, much more than how much you end up earning and so on.
I mean, a lot of people are switching careers sort of in their 50s or 60s even, and going back to university, taking up a new subject. And there's space for them to do that. And there is always the chance you can.
Well, thank you. You've helped us think about a great deal, a lot about education, in fact. So I'm going to call questions to an end now because we're good St. Hilda's people in this room and we have guests and we want to give people a drink. So I'm going to say thank you very much again, Joan. Thank you. And
thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you.
And the drinks are available outside in the JDP foyer. I heard some promising rattling earlier. So if you just make your way out this end, or we can push the bar to open here and get out to the drinks. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was